we're very lucky to have Vivienne Selwyn with us today, who actually, this is what I love about, and the reason why I wanted to do, and we wanted to create this whole thing, is that Vivienne literally sits in the row in front of me, and she turns up in Shaw most weekends, but we don't actually get to speak. We speak about, you know, the, like, health and family and stuff, but to actually know what people do or did or, you know, have done in their lives is just really the reason why we wanted to do this process. So Vivienne, bless her, has a fantastic, I've got a very long history, because she's done some incredible things over, I shouldn't say so many years, but a number of years. And they've really spanned market research and a lot of travel from one country to another. So starting life in Australia, born in Australia, grew up in London, but went into research. I'm going to let her give you some of that specific. And then traveled over to Brussels and spent 7 years living there as well. And yeah, like everywhere. North Shore, eastern suburbs, east, west, north, south, a lot of variety and richness in your career. So I'm interested to hear all about it, and of course how it eventuated that you're now, excuse me, doing a PhD in grumpy old men, which is why we're here today. So please tell us more.
Thank you, Caroline, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. It's nice of you to tune in and sort of listen. So yes, as Caroline said, over the years we've travelled, and at the back of my mind was always this idea that I was going to go back and study something more. So sort of 20 years into Australia, and with the children sort of grown up, I got to a point where I thought, if I'm going to do this, maybe I should, you know, not keep on putting it off, but actually see what happens. So I decided to approach Macquarie University, which was the easiest one to get into as a mature student. You just had to write them a letter. And I thought, I'll do something I've never done before. So I steered clear of sciences that I did at school, business that I did as career and whatever. I thought, I'll go for the arts that I know absolutely nothing about. And decided to apply for a course called Critical and Cultural Studies. I didn't actually know what that was. It came out of the film school. And what it is a way of looking at things and trying to work out why you think about things the way you do. So what drives you to look at something and respond the way you do? And usually we don't think about that. It's sort of mindfulness, but it's a little bit more than that. So I went through and came across some amazingly different things. I ended up doing that with a minor in anthropology. So my interest in people and where they are and how they go on. And that led to what's called a Masters of Research. And for that, I had to come up with a project to do, which was a research project with a thesis presentation at the end. As this was happening, I was starting to get letters from the government saying, well, you know, you're getting older and you should be tested for this and for that, and have you got your seniors card? And I started getting really annoyed about people telling me I was old when I didn't feel old and what that meant. So my thesis ended up being titled Representations of Aging in the Australian National Press between 2010 and 2016. What it meant was I looked through the major newspapers and pulled out articles that talked about the aging population. Not the ones that talked about Botox and surgery and those sorts of things, but the ones that talked about the aging population. And I tried to work out what it was saying. And there were two real stories that came out of it. And one sort of umbrella definition, and that was that there was an aging population that was homogenous. That means that everybody's pretty much the same, which is quite interesting because in Australia and the way they go about defining it, that's about 4.5 million people. So you've got 4.5 million people, men and women, who are really very different, but no, they're all the same. So that was the starting point where I started getting a little bit upset. Then as I looked at it, there were two other strands. One was that you either actively aging, and that is not just in Australia, this is actually an international phrase. It's in the World Health Organization. You look it up and you'll find reams of pages on Google about active aging. That means these are the people who are taking control of their lives, maintaining their bodies, maintaining their place in society, delivering to society. In other words, you're still earning money, or, I mean, voluntary work is sort of an odd one that is almost not considered, but you are actively responsible for yourself. Then there are those people who are in decline. So the minute you have health issues, the minute that you have needs for any sort of supports, the minute that you're drawing a pension of any sort, you become in decline and you're then a non-person. So as older people, you're not really considered, but when you're in decline, you are about the same level as a baby in terms of the interest and attention that anyone's going to pay to you. So you have this idea of these, and they kept talking about the aging population, and the aging population is a real problem. It is growing. It is going to require an awful lot more money, so it's financially difficult for most countries. At the same time, it's holding on to assets. So people are hanging on to their houses. They're carrying on working and not giving young people room for jobs, even though you have to be working. I mean, as you can imagine, there's a lot of issues around that. And then within that, I started having a look at, I came across some things around men, and it's quite interesting that there's more research around women because of feminism and where that's taken it over the last 30 years than there actually is around men. And most of the research around men, the academic research, sits around younger men. When you come to people who are slightly older, it just really looks at areas of health and health issues rather than men sort of as a group. So I started being interested in the fact that you have what are known as older men and sort of what that means. Now, my research is looking at them in community men's sheds, which is a very specific area. But some of the things I've come across and I want to talk about today are really more front of mind about that. So first of all, what does it mean to be old? When we talk about old, who's old? It's how you see something depends on you, the way you frame your world, the stage you're at, the society that you're living in. It's a combination of all things. When you're 10, someone of 30 might be old. When you're 30, someone of 50 might be old. When you're 50, who do you define as old? So there's a lot of talk about older people, but who are these older people? And where do you put yourself within that? So that's sort of a question that sits at the bottom of it. But you hear this phrase, grumpy old men. I mean, Caroline found the most wonderful visual for it, which came from the Muppets, and that's about a 30-year-old visual originally. So there have been television programs about grumpy old men. So again, who is a grumpy old man? What is a grumpy old man? Why do we talk about grumpy old men? So I guess the question is really, what's a man? When you walk down the street and you're looking at people, you subconsciously look at them and go, that's a man, that's a woman. So there are visual clues that within particular society you've grown up in gives you ideas about who's a man and who's a woman. Is that a man? It's someone you're perceiving as a man, but what does that mean? What does it mean to be a man? How do you define a man? Well, each of us have different ways of doing it. I mean, there are academic theorists who say there are 7 areas of masculinity, and you go from the hard drinking, hard talking, hard man, maybe violent, through to someone who's at the top of the power scale. So, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. We talk about, people behaving like men, whatever that means. So we all of us have our own vision of what it means to be a man, and a man has his own vision of what it means to be a man. In the time that a lot of us have grown up, which is sort of post-war, baby boomer, whatever, there's still a lot of stereotypes, family stereotypes. So a man was the provider, the man is bringing the money in, the woman is more looking after the children. Women may well have worked in this time as well, but there are still imbalances in the power. So men have the power. They may not have quite as much control in the house. Men had careers, so they might have been following a line. It doesn't matter whether they were a tradesperson following a trade career or whether they're a professional person following a professional career. There is this idea that the man went out to work, the man earned the money, the man either controlled the money or shared it, whatever. So as men get older and start coming towards retirement age, and there is actually no retirement age in Australia. There's an age when you can draw a pension, but there is no legal age of retirement for anybody. But as men come to that, what's becoming more apparent is that for many men, their sense of self and their ideal of themselves is tied around the role that they have had. So it's a working role, and it's also a role within family. Their position within that family, and that's absolutely fine. When you take a major part of that role away, are they still a man? How do they see themselves? But also, how does everyone around them see them? So if you're in a relationship with someone, if you're married, whatever, if you're no longer in the same role that you had, how do you still feel that you're a man when something very large has been moved away from you? And that's often the point where we talk about grumpy old men, because leaving work is often seen as a sign of aging. So, it's the first sign, because you're no longer within it. Now, you might try and work for yourself, you might find voluntary things, you might look for all of those things to put together. But often there's a period of 2-3 years when a man is trying to work out who he is and what he is and how he can still feel like himself. As any time between 50 and 75, you might find that you are less strong than you were. You're not quite as fit as you were, however fit you actually are. That you might need glasses or your hearing or whatever. You're not the person you were when you were 40. You're not still on the upward slope. You've sort of reached a point, but it's a new point that has very few clues as to how to maintain it. So it's a period when you may get depression creeping in, you may get feelings of not knowing. I mean, the other side, you've got a partner who's suddenly trying to deal with a very different person to the one that they knew, and that can create tensions as well. So this is where this idea, you've got grumpy old men. Are they these men at this point? And some people will say yes. Some people will say no, it's not my generation, it's the next generation up. So if one's still lucky enough to have parents, we'll say, well, no, it's the people who are closer to their 80s and 90s who become the grumpy old men. They become curmudgeonly, they become very fixed in their viewpoints. They have to be right all the time. So it's those sorts of questions that I've sort of started looking at and trying to understand, what is it that drives these things, and why do we look at men at this point and say, well, they're grumpy and they're old? They're actually not old. They are just at a different point of life. They're not grumpy. They might be lost. It's a bit like Peter Pan and the Lost Boys. This is another stage, but it's a stage that isn't actually looked at, and it's a stage that isn't really considered. Men are not expected to look at their feelings and discuss them. They're not really expected to be lost. They're expected to, men solve problems. They just go forward. They work it out. But this is a different part of life, and they're not necessarily working it out. And often as society, we look at them and we laugh. And again, we treat them as something that is not terribly important because we don't understand where they're coming from and how they're going. And in the newspapers, in the media, on TV, in all sorts of places, you're seeing this same idea that, these men who are older are often sidelined if they're not fitting a particular viewpoint that we still think is good, which is young, vibrant, driving a sports car, having a midlife crisis, whatever. So, I mean, this is all sort of from pre-COVID. I think with COVID, what it's done is it's exacerbated a lot of this. It's made it worse because you've got people who are finding themselves in this situation who weren't expecting to find themselves in this situation yet. Maybe at home and not really knowing how to deal with it. But I'm really looking at it pre that. And so my comments are really about that time before COVID and, how we look at these men and how we perceive them and how we portray them as well. And you see less of that with women. You will see it in films. You will see it in the newspapers. If you go looking for it, you will see it, on the news, and you will see, photographs. If they want to suggest a grumpy old man, they'll put him in baggy clothes, glasses, and slightly hunched. And that is the absolute picture of a grumpy old man, and you don't need any words to go with it. You just look at it and think, yep, I understand what that's saying. So it's really quite interesting to stop sometimes and think, hang on a minute, why am I accepting all of this? Why am I just, I don't even think twice about my reaction as that, of seeing that as the norm. So that's really where my research is at, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at it in a very specific space of people who are going into it and saying, well, this stops me from putting that category. But I'm also looking to see why people don't go into that. But there are, for many people and many families, this is a really difficult stage to manage. And I think sometimes we don't try and manage it. We look at it and say, I'm too tired to deal with this. Go away and work it out. I'm just not interested in knowing. We look at it, we see someone, or we're talking to someone, and they're getting very het up with their viewpoint. And that they're older and maybe they're a little bit more rigid in their views. But it doesn't mean that we should just ignore those views completely, because that is what happens. And men find that much harder because they've had positions of power. I mean, in society, they have positions of power. And so when they start being ignored, they find that even harder to deal with. I think women are a little bit more used to it. I'm being very sexist here. We do get ignored a little bit more often, so we've had to work out ways of dealing with that. Anyway, I hope that's given everybody something to think about. I'm happy to answer questions or engage in a discussion about it. Please feel free to ask or to make comments. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, I was like literally nodding all the way through that. We have some terrible stereotypes of men, but I have to say my heart goes out to them, because I've always thought the same thing. When a career ends, like, who are you? You're very much defined by what you do rather than who you are. And it must be very hard for men in particular who don't necessarily have group, like women tend to have their they can chit chat amongst each other and they can lament and get solace from each other. How are men doing that? You were talking about men's sheds.
There's men's sheds, and it's amazing because in Australia that's the biggest men's organisation that exists. So it's estimated there are between 100,000 and 150,000 men who are members of community men's sheds. Now that's about 10% of older men, and that's really taken as sort of 65 and above, which is generally the way it's perceived. There are also other organizations that men get involved in. I mean, you've got voluntary things and things like that, but a lot of men don't have the networks. They have work networks. If you play sport of some sort, so you're a golfer, a tennis player, something like that, you might have those networks. You might have some old friends that you've maintained from school, from university, particularly if you're living in a country area. But in the cities where you've got more mobile populations, and also where you've got, I mean, Australia has a lot of immigrants in it, your links may not be as strong. And as you're saying, Caroline, women find it easier to stop in a shop and chat to someone. You know, men will more likely walk into the shop, buy what they need and walk out again. So making links is part of the difficulty. You do have things. I mean, the shul provides links for some people that they're using it in that sense. But there's a lot of men out there who were strongly connected with work. And when for one reason or another, they find they're no longer connected with work, it's not only their identity, it's a sense of worth. Because at the moment, being someone who contributes is so much part of the underlying story in Australia. And if you're not contributing, you're a bludger.
Mm.
And if you're not contributing, the presumption is it's because you aren't making the effort, not because there's any barriers to you being able to contribute. So for me, one of the things men's sheds do is they allow the men to contribute. They actually, the majority of them have links within the community, and they have some sort of charity links as well in terms of what they're doing. So it's allowing the men to feel connected and to feel that they are actually offering something at the same time. But for a man who doesn't have access to any of that, or doesn't know how to access any of that, or doesn't feel comfortable trying to access any of it, then no. I mean, who is he? What is he? How is he judged? It's not just his wife and his family who's judging him, it's everybody else they come across. You walk into a doctor's office and they say to you, well, you know, we just need to check your records. What do you do these days? You know, I'm retired, I'm unemployed, I'm still working. There is an automatic judgment even when we don't think about it. You know, you look at someone and you make a judgment about them. They open their mouth and say something, you make a judgment about it. It's trying to see the reasons that we make those judgments, what's driving us.
Mm. Okay, that's fantastic. Are there any comments from or questions from any of the men that we've got with us today?
I'm going to comment on behalf of a man that I have with us today.
Grumpy.
a grumpy one. No, he's not grumpy. We were in, where were we? In Arizona, and we walked into one of these little souvenir shops. And I don't know if you can read that. Steve found this, and it says, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you are? And he said, you know, because Vivienne, you had talked about how old we feel or how we're perceived. And he said, oh my gosh, he said, that's just amazing. You know, he must have been in his 50s then. He said, I feel like I'm 34. And this, we bought the, for $3, we bought this, and it sits on our refrigerator and always has. And if you just think about it, if you didn't know how old you are, how old would you be?
There is ageism in society. So I mean, you have. So when I was doing undergrad at uni, I had, and because I was in cultural studies and old people do not do cultural studies, I really stood out like a sore thumb. And I had one person I was chatting to one day, one of the young girls, who said, I really like that you're there, you bring a different feel to what we're talking about. And then a few weeks later, I had one of the young guys turn around and say to me, oh God, I wish you weren't in this group. You sure as hell make it very difficult. And it was to do with, it was two reactions to me as an older person in the group. And I wasn't expected to be there. There's other courses that have many more mature students. This one didn't. When you walk into a shop, they look at you and make judgments on you. I mean, you're judged for your hair color, you're judged for the way you look, you're judged when you open your mouth. There are judgments made the whole time. As older people, we already have less of a voice. Simply because we're older, and at the moment, pre-COVID, we were actually being held up as the reason for a lot of problems. We were going to break the Australian economy. Don't worry, the rest of the older people around the world were going to do the same thing for their economies. This was actually across the world. We were going to break the economies. We were hindering young people. There was so much negativity about us, and seriously, I found 170 articles in mainstream newspapers over a 6-year period that actually 90% of them framed older people as a problem. So if you start from the fact that we're perceived as a problem, regardless of how we see ourselves, it becomes sort of more difficult. And then when you look at men, I mean, their role is to be vibrant, to be powerful, to be working, whether it's physically or cognitively, whatever. And then they get to a point where I thought, well, no, I mean, all of it's as if it's turned off. Just because you've reached a point where maybe you're wearing, you've got white hair and a slightly bigger waistline, somehow you've lost your ability to think, your ability to function. I mean, we've seen people being forced out of jobs because they're older and not being able to get jobs again. But it's more than just that. It's the way that we're perceived. It's the way that they're presented. And I think for old men, it is older men, not old men. That's something totally different. I mean, to be an old man, you're walking with a stick or in a wheelchair and drooling. But to be older is to be less.
Okay. So Agnes has a question. I need to get you to unmute. That's it. No, unmute. We can't hear. Can't hear. Or maybe Sharon can unmute everyone.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Great. Vivienne, first of all, thank you very much. It's not a sexy topic, and really admire you for having gone back as an older student to do something that is so unsexy perhaps, and very much needed, researching into elderly people, and particularly elderly men, because they have been left aside very much so. I haven't got a question, so this is more comments, I suppose. Having worked in the aged care sector pretty well all my life from the medical point of view, and one of the things when our department started to do research on health of older men, so it's the CHAMP study, you might have come across it, and it has really followed men over a number of years now in the Sydney local health district to the western side largely. And it was interesting because at the beginning it was very, very difficult to recruit the men. But over the time that the study's been going, they managed to get more men. And the thing is, as I have left the workforce nearly 10 years ago and find myself in that older age group, it's interesting that I think that women suffer from exactly the same thing as men. I think the issues that you brought up, like, you know, who am I after I've left work? What am I going to do? I think we tend so much to generalize, and it's such an difficult area when you're doing sociological studies, not to group people. And yet when you look at the older cohort, which, yes, we're going to say over 65, is that in fact, the older we get, we are actually far more diverse, whether you're talking about health or activity or interests. So, you know, you can actually put groups, you know, when you're a baby, you're much narrower. There's a normal range. But that range, as we get older and older, diverges rather than narrowing. So in fact, making generalizations becomes so difficult. And I think it's also a socioeconomic thing as well, that if you look at older people, the self-employed, both women and men are working longer, whether it's an impetus because their finances or because in fact they just love to work and they have the ability to continue to work. And I sort of felt that I myself had a narrow view on things. And now I see really active men, whether they're their clubs. So go to Rotary, you know, see them volunteering everywhere. You know, you just have to go to Bunnings and who's out there? Older men working, the experienced men. So, I mean, that's just some of the comments that I wish to make.
You're quite right in what you're saying. And I'm not denying women face the same issues. The reason, what interested me with men is that for many men, their trajectory has been much more linear, much more in a straight line. Women quite often change elements of themselves. Women, if women are in a relationship, married or unmarried these days, it really doesn't matter. But they tend to do, there is a suggestion that they adapt slightly more than the men necessarily do at the same time. If women have children, they have to bring that into it. Often if there's care of parents and things like that, I'm not saying that men don't do it, but women do carry a larger part of that burden. So over the course of sort of moving from childhood through to the later years of adulthood, I think that women, and there's research that shows this, women sort of have more elements to themselves. So there is a degree of resilience that can be built in. And again, I'm generalizing, and everybody is different, and that's the point. For many men, they're not asked to make as many adaptations. So when they do hit a roadblock, it might be losing a job at some point in time. It might be having to move the family somewhere totally different, whatever it is. It might not come until you're getting closer to retirement age. They have less resilience. They haven't had to face rebuilding themselves as many times, or finding the different sort of parts of themselves and making those work, or even having to ask the questions, okay, how do I deal with this now? You know, who am I going to be? Yes, there are a lot of men who are getting involved in a wide range of things. I mean, my project is around men. It's actually around diversity. I'm not taking diversity in terms of just age and race and the usual sorts of things. I'm trying to understand some of the deeper underlying elements that bring some people into men's sheds and some people who don't come in. And in all fairness, within my research, I found sheds where most of the people came from professional backgrounds, and sheds where most of the people came from trade backgrounds. So it certainly isn't a social class element that is creating it. There's a range of other things that are there. The point is that whilst we as people understand that we're different, and that, you know, I'll say my husband is different to someone else's husband, and he's different to his own brothers, and he's different to my brothers, and everything else. Society tends to group us. Whether we want them to or not, society groups us. So my comments today have been along the lines of the way that some of these groupings work. And any individual can turn around and say, but it doesn't apply to me. And it may not apply to them. But it doesn't mean that society doesn't presume it does.
Right, it's true. I do believe Mr. Lewis has a comment to make.
Oh, good.
The grumpy Mr. Lewis.
Not grumpy, Mr. Lewis.
Not yet grumpy.
Not
I must admit,
grumpy.
the thought of entering a men's shed fills me with absolute dread and horror, particularly as the concept of it seems to revolve around tools, which I am incapable of identifying, let alone using. But the thing, thanks Vivienne so much, the thing I wanted to ask is whether you've looked at another aspect within your research. I think I certainly don't feel like I'm old, and I'm under 65, but I'm over 60. But I think it's a really hard time to be male across a number of different ages. And something that sheets it home to me particularly this week, which Caroline knows exactly what I'm going to say, is Dyson Hayden. And, you know, when we've got the highest, you know, Chief Justice of the High Court, who's you know, as a parasite, men are characterised so much through many ages now of being, you know, sexually parasitic, and we're dangerous, and we're dangerous to women of all ages. It's horrible. It's really nasty, and particularly for us who are not like that. You know, we're far more circumspect in terms of how we're going to deal with people, women in particular. We're meant to, Dyson Hayden aside, obviously, but, you know, we're certainly very aware of this now, that we're viewed by many people, unfortunately, as dangerous. And, you know, have you looked at this at all in terms of how this translates to an element of grumpiness, if not fear?
I haven't, in the sense that it's not sitting within the research that I'm doing. But the interesting thing is that when I asked people, why do you think some people might not fit into this space? And they're not talking to me about someone like you who says, well, I mean, they might say, well, they don't like tools, which is fine. But I have heard them say, well, the people who are not going to fit in are the people who have anger management problems. I had someone turn around and say to me, well, we don't want pedophiles here because, you know, we sometimes work at the local schools. Now, this was the interview happened only a few weeks after George Pell was sentenced. And there was you know, obviously that was top of mind. I mean, what they're saying is that within men, there are men who are more acceptable and men who are less acceptable. Society puts the onus on all men. You know, men are bad, men are potentially violent, men are, you know, men need to be very careful around women. Women need to be very aware that men can hurt them and all of that. I think we're demonizing, society is demonizing men at the moment, and labeling all men with one label, regardless of whether it's true or not. I haven't really covered that in my research. It's not part of my question, but I was interested talking to another academic who's doing a sociological piece of work, and men's sheds come into it. And he made the link between the funding that goes from the federal government to men's sheds and the funding that goes to women's shelters. And he said that men's sheds don't work to stop men being violent and to stop men abusing women and all of that. And that's actually not part of what they're about. So they don't do that. And he was really making that link. Now, in an academic sense, that was not a link that I've made, because it's not the way that I am looking about it. But at the same time, as a person, I felt that I didn't agree with the link. I think, I mean, from my side, I think that women's shelters should be funded much more than they are, and that programs for women should be funded much more than they are. But at the same time, I didn't feel that you take away from men, because there are some men who create problems and not others. I think it's going to be a while before that way of looking at men is going to go. I think that at the moment, my personal view is that views that are put out by the media and by a lot of other spaces create binaries. You have to sit on one side or the other side of an issue. There's no middle ground. There's very little room for debate. So you either say that all men are demonic, or you're on the other side and saying, no men are demonic. The truth is that everybody is different, and there are some men who are not good people. There are some women who are not good either. I mean, we don't discuss that at all. That is not acceptable at the moment, and that's a totally different debate, and that's a debate about what's being said in society and why that's being driven, and the different sources that are pushing those ideas and what's behind why they're doing that. And that is, I think that's a really, really, really big problem at the moment. I don't have any answers.
Right. Oh,
thank you for the question.
Do we have another question? Does anybody, I'm looking. Agnes has got her hand up again. Yes, hello. And Jill, if you'd like to unmute as well, Jill.
Vivienne, I'm just wondering, I'm not sure of the exact question that you are trying to answer with your research. I may have missed that, having come in just a little bit late. But the questions I have other than that one are divisions within the age group, since we're obviously talking about age 65, and a group, for example, like the Council on the Aging, COTA. I don't know if you're having anything to do with them while you're doing your research, but I find that they actually sort of are a young, very active political group and very strong grey power, but they really don't identify with the more frail aged. And it's like, we don't want to talk about that group. So with divisions within quite a powerful, strong lobbyist group, and then the other groups that obviously the frail aged, the cognitively impaired, and the different sexual orientations. These are groups that, you know, I'm wondering about whether you are looking at it all or they're not entering into that, and your thoughts on those areas.
In terms of the men's sheds, the oldest person I've come across was 97 and still using tools. Being in a shed, when I ask people why they might stop, it's only because they will be physically incapable of carrying on going. So for them, the divide is between being physically able and physically unable. So it's not actually age-based, it's about ability. And this goes back to what I said at the very beginning about active aging and decline. So active aging goes on to whatever age you can still be active. It's very simple. If you're 103, I knew a lady who passed away at 103, and she only moved into a home at 102. Prior to that, she was living on her own with a bit of support, but boy, she was a feisty lady and very, very capable. So the decline is where you're talking about the frail. And in Australia at the moment and around the world, the frail really do not have a voice. They do, obviously. There are groups that look at them, but it's in terms of service provision. It's not in terms really of saying these people might be frail, but they still have something to offer to this world and to this country. It's a case of saying, what provisions do we need for them? How much is it going to cost? Who's going to provide it? And how long is it going to last for? I mean, Australia did not send out letters to people saying, if you end up in hospital, or if you're in an aged care home, please don't send them to the hospital. Now, there were letters like that went out in England. If you were over 65 and happened to get COVID, there was a suggestion at one point that you would not be sent to hospital because you were more expendable than someone else. It's not as strong as that in Australia, but frail. And here you've got younger people who've got disabilities who actually sit in that line. That doesn't come into my research, but actually exists within this. If you're frail, if you require support from the services in any way, you are not really considered as a person within society. You're considered as a drain. And that's about, I mean, I can wrap it up in a whole load of academic language, but in its simplest, that is the presumption, and that is the viewpoint, and that's the way you're dealt with. Not by your own immediate family. That maybe may not be, but society. And the organizations, the powerful organizations, you're talking of government and things like that. You've got groups that try and work and politic, but the frail are at the bottom of the heap. So if you like, you can put the frail along with Indigenous. I mean, it's about an equivalent level of problem in if you want to put it into political terms. As long as you're active, you have a voice. Your voice is nowhere near as strong as someone who is younger and in the workforce and is delivering to society. If you have a look at the newspapers at the moment, there is a big debate just starting to happen as to who's going to pay for the difficulties that the Australian economy is going to face over the next 20 years. And over the next year or two, we're going to see that older people are going to be held accountable. Why should the younger people have to pay for the issues that have cropped up? Older people are sitting on money, they're sitting on super, they're drawing pensions and things like that. That debate that was around 5 years ago about people hanging on to their homes and things like that will come back round as to how to pay for COVID once the illness phase of it is out of the way and the economic phase starts to pick up again. And you're starting to see a few lines of that coming through even now. So these are the narratives. These are, you know, and they're pushed by a lot of different people. So it might be political, it might be health related, it might be a group with a particular edge that is trying to get something through. You know, but it sits there within society.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Agnes, as well. Jill, you had something you wanted to ask?
Well, I think we've covered what I wanted to say, but I'm very aware that in Australia, probably all over the world, we value people a lot for what they do, but not who they are. And that then becomes a problem for older people, because people think once you've stopped earning money, that maybe you're not so interesting anymore. And I think that's quite tough.
It is.
And you know, I mean, I'm pretty noisy, and but I'm aware that you know, it's very easy to be very easy to be ignored as you get older, as a woman or as a man, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's very nice. I've enjoyed your talk enormously, and it'll be interesting. I think things are changing, but they're changing very slowly. I think Australians do value people for what they do, not for who they are.
Yeah.
If I make an enormous generalization, I know there are plenty of people who don't come into that category. It's always quite a shock to me when I listen to people.
And we have to take care of those people as well.
Yeah,
there's a lot around mental health and well-being when it comes to ending transitioning from one part of your life to another.
That's right.
Yeah. We have Anna. Anna, you need to unmute. We've got time for one more question, Anna. just unmute your microphone.
It's not a question. I came in half an hour late.
Right. Yes, we
I was
noticed.
wondering if I could have a copy of the first half back. The second half, I would have liked to have asked questions, but I probably would ask questions that have already been answered.
Well, it's nice to see you.
Can I have a copy of the first half?
It will be published on our website. All of our recordings are on the website.
Sometimes they don't open, but I'll let you know if it doesn't.
Okay, please do. Has anyone else got any more questions or comments about this lovely, most interesting session that we've had? Anybody else? No?
Well, it was just the question still is, what is the question that you're trying to answer with your research, Vivienne?
So it's an intersectional approach to diversity amongst aging men in community men's sheds. And intersectionality in this sense, I'm taking it back to its origins. So its origins came out of feminism studies, where generally the idea of being a feminist was middle-class white women. And black women said, but hang on a minute, we're marginalized in a different way to white women, and not all black women are marginalized in the same way. So our experiences affect the way that we are marginalized as women, and then our race and color affect it even more. So I'm taking a line that is not usually acceptable to say that within men, there are groups who are marginalized. So that's starting from a point that is academically not usually accepted, because men have power. But what I'm saying is that older men have less power than younger men. They're considered as being less valuable, and that they have a lesser voice. And then I'm having a look at one particular space, which is community men's sheds, and trying to understand what draws some people in and what keeps some people out. And one of the things that is coming up is that a lot of men who belong say, well, it's a place for me. Now, David said quite adamantly it would never be a place for him. So because it's linked to tools, that is already excluding him. Now, it's excluding him on a very simple level. But he could also be excluded because one of the places I looked at, the sign outside of it was in English, but every other sign on the street as I walked down, and including on vans and things like that, was in Vietnamese. So the space that it's in is within an ethnic community that is different. But its signage, and when I looked in its front door, a lot of the things they'd made were shields for various NRL clubs. So if you're walking past the street, you're walking along and you see a sign that's in English, and you see shields for NRL clubs, you make a very quick decision as to whether you fit or not. Before you ever set foot inside, you can decide that it is not the space for me. There's another one I went to that flies the Australian flag, and that's a whole other can of worms as to who may or may not feel included by that. So I'm looking at some of those things. I'm also looking at some organizational factors. I'm talking to the people inside to see if they understand why other people may not come. So what I'm trying to understand is not just, is it race, is it class, but what are a lot of the things that we don't actually take account of that are saying, this is a place for me, or this is not a place for me. And really, I'm doing it in community men's sheds, and I'm doing it about aging men. You can do it about anything and anywhere. It can be the shop that I don't feel comfortable walking into. It can be the particular shul I do not feel comfortable walking into because I feel that I'm not the right person for it. An example is, I was in Israel with my daughter, and we'd been to the cave of the matriarchs as part of a tour. We were walking back out, and some lady stopped me, and she said to me, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you a mother?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, why are you dressed like that?" I have my daughter next to me. I was wearing a t-shirt and long shorts. It was the middle of summer. I had covered myself with scarves when I was inside, but I was outside and 100 meters away, walking back towards, on the driveway towards my bus. She harangued me for 10 minutes It was embarrassing. It was difficult. It made me feel totally unwelcome in a place I should have felt welcome. So what makes us feel we belong? What makes us feel we don't belong? I'm looking at it in one particular space around one particular group of people. I could have done this about anybody. This just drew my interest, and the university was willing to fund it. That's the reality of how research gets done. The university is willing to accept it as a project, and the government then funds it. If they don't, you don't do it. That's a whole, again, a different can of worms, but that's what I'm looking at.
Gosh, I feel like we could sit here talking about grumpy old men all day. It's been fascinating. We have filled an entire hour, and I know that probably you'll be the agony aunt of the shul when women come and sit next to you and go, can you tell me what you can do about my husband? He's driving me mad.
Be kind. Be kind.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions, is what are we doing to do that? But
We're not. It's very individual.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I feel like, I know in London where we belong to shul there, that it's a real men's club there. Those boys, and the same with going to the football, you know, they have this group of men that can travel together through generations and be there for all the highs and lows. And I mean, I think that's the value of shul, but I'm sure there's the value of lots of other different organizations and spaces for people to feel that sense of belonging and support. And I think maybe men need to be more receptive to support as well. It would be, you know, to be embraced by that. But I honestly can't thank you enough for such an amazing hour well spent. It was fascinating, and we'll be coming over and having a chat with you in shul when we see you.
Thanks all for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Vivienne. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful.